She was deserted by love at 40. But the most coveted Duke saw beyond her past. London, spring 1861. The gardens of Pemberton House blazed with late afternoon sunlight, transforming the carefully manicured lawns into a tableau of emerald brilliance dotted with ladies' parasols like floating blossoms. Beneath an ancient wisteria arbor, half hidden by cascading purple blooms, stood Sharon Roberts, her 40 years sitting upon her like an invisible brand as she watched the laughing guests drift past like ghosts from a life she would never know. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know the story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Let's begin. Lady Helena Whitmore's voice drifted on the spring breeze to her sister-in-law, just loud enough to carry. Sharon Roberts has accepted yet another invitation. After what happened 15 years ago, one would think a woman with such a past would have the grace to simply disappear. The words, though delivered with the practiced sweetness of poison honey, struck Sharon's chest like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of the morning she had stood in her wedding gown, waiting at St. Michael's Church while whispers spread through the pews like wildfire. He's not coming. He's left her. She's been abandoned. Sharon's gloved fingers tightened imperceptibly around the ivory handle of her parasol, but she did not move, did not betray by even the flicker of an eyelash that she had heard. 20 years of practice had taught her the art of becoming invisible while standing in plain sight. "Sharon, you needn't torture yourself by remaining," her sister-in-law Margaret had whispered earlier, concern etching lines around her kind eyes. "We can leave whenever you wish." But Sharon had simply shaken her head. "I will not give them the satisfaction of driving me away entirely." Now, as the golden afternoon light filtered through the wisteria, casting lace-like shadows across her dusty rose gown, Sharon Roberts stood at the margins of society. A cautionary tale, a whispered scandal, a woman whom fate had judged and found wanting. And then everything changed. A ripple of excitement moved through the garden like wind through wheat. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Parasols tilted at more becoming angles. Young ladies smoothed already perfect curls and arranged their features into expressions of carefully calculated indifference. Gerald Clem, Duke of Ravenwood, had arrived. Sharon had seen him before, of course. One could hardly move in London society without encountering the Duke at some function or another. But she had never been close enough to truly observe him, had never dared to do more than glance briefly in his direction before looking away, as one might glance at the sun before wisely averting one's eyes. He moved through the garden with the unconscious confidence of a man who had never known rejection, his dark coat perfectly tailored across broad shoulders, his bearing suggesting generations of unquestioned privilege. His hair, dark as midnight, showed just a thread of silver at the temples. And his eyes, even from this distance, Sharon could see their unusual intensity, a blue so piercing it seemed to see through the elaborate performances that constituted polite society. Every eligible lady in attendance, and several not-so-eligible ones, found reasons to drift into his path. Lady Cordelia Ashworth, resplendent in primrose silk that complemented her golden curls, positioned herself near the fountain with strategic precision. The Debenham sisters flanked the refreshment table like sentries. Even the married Lady Petton herself found urgent reason to adjust the floral arrangements directly in line with the Duke's approach. Sharon watched this familiar theater with the detachment of someone observing a world in which she had no part to play. The Duke would exchange pleasantries, would dance with one or perhaps two of the season's celebrated beauties, and would leave precisely when propriety allowed. He had been performing this same ritual for 15 years, they said, politely declining every attempt to secure his interest, turning away heiresses and titled ladies with equal impartiality. A man who has everything has no need of anyone, Sharon thought, a flash of something almost like sympathy piercing her resignation. "Perhaps we are both prisoners, Your Grace, you of your perfection, and I of my disgrace. And then, impossibly, his eyes found hers. Across the expanse of lawn, through the drifting parasols and milling guests, the Duke of Ravenwood's piercing blue gaze locked onto Sharon Roberts with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. For a moment, one eternal, impossible moment, the garden seemed to fall silent, the chattering voices fading to nothing as those eyes held hers with an expression she could not name. Recognition. Curiosity. No. It was something else entirely. Something that made her heart, long resigned to stillness, suddenly remember how to race. The Duke's path shifted. Lady Cordelia's carefully arranged smile faltered as he walked past her without a glance. The Debenham sisters' elaborate greetings went unacknowledged. Lady Petton's strategic floral arrangement might as well have been invisible. Because Gerald Clem, Duke of Ravenwood, the most sought-after bachelor in England, the man who had refused princesses and turned away heiresses, was walking directly toward the wisteria arbor where Sharon Roberts stood frozen in disbelief. This cannot be happening. Her mind insisted even as her eyes confirmed the impossible truth. The whispers began before he had crossed half the distance. Fans snapped open with the sharp report of scandal unfolding. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-word. Is he truly? Surely he must be mistaken. Someone should warn him who she. But the Duke did not falter. His stride remained steady, purposeful, his eyes never leaving Sharon's face as he closed the distance between them. Sharon's every instinct screamed at her to flee, to spare herself the inevitable humiliation of whatever game this must surely be. Dukes did not seek out ruined spinsters. Men of impeccable reputation did not publicly acknowledge women marked by scandal. This could only be some terrible mistake, some cosmic cruelty that would end with her standing exposed before all of society once more. But her feet would not move. She could only stand there, parasol clutched in trembling hands, as the Duke of Ravenwood came to a stop directly before her. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, which were studying her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow was not. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, a weariness, perhaps, that spoke of his own private battles fought behind the armor of privilege and perfection. "Miss Roberts," he said, his voice a deep baritone that somehow managed to be both commanding and gentle. It was not a question. "Your Grace," Sharon managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. Around them, she could feel the weight of every eye in the garden, could sense the held breath of scandal about to unfold. "I find," the Duke continued, as calmly as if they were not currently the focus of London society's most intense scrutiny, "that I have been monopolizing the same conversations and enduring the same performances for rather longer than is healthy for one's perspective." He paused, and the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I believe the view is far more compelling from this vantage point." Sharon's mind raced to comprehend what was happening. Was he mocking her? Testing her? Playing some elaborate game whose rules she could not fathom? But there was no cruelty in his eyes. No hidden laughter. Only that same intense interest, as if he were studying a painting that had unexpectedly captured his attention. "I'm afraid," Sharon said carefully, years of defending herself against cruelty making her choose each word with precision, "that I cannot imagine what could be compelling about watching from the shadows, Your Grace." "Can you not?" His voice held genuine curiosity. "I would have thought that someone who observes rather than performs might see what all these eager performers cannot. There is a particular clarity, I find, that comes from standing apart from the theater." Something in Sharon's chest, some long-dormant thing that had learned not to hope, stirred dangerously to life. Behind them, the whispers had become a roar. But the Duke of Ravenwood did not seem to notice. Or perhaps, Sharon thought with dawning wonder, he simply did not care. "Tell me, Miss Roberts," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe he truly wanted to know the answer. "Do you dance?" Chapter 1. 15 years. That was how long Sharon Roberts had lived in the shadow of a single morning. The morning she had stood in St. Michael's Church in her ivory silk gown, orange blossoms wilting in her trembling hands, while the guests' whispers grew from confused murmurs to pitying certainty. "He's not coming. Gerald Whitmore has abandoned her at the altar." 15 years of those words following her like a curse she could never outrun. "Sharon, you needn't torture yourself by attending these functions," her brother Thomas had said that very morning as their carriage rattled toward Pemberton House. His weathered face creased with concern, the same expression he had worn since that terrible day when he'd had to lead her from the church, her wedding gown trailing behind her like a burial shroud. "No one expects it of you. God knows no one would fault you for staying home." But Sharon had simply adjusted her gloves with hands that no longer trembled at such memories. "I will not give them the satisfaction of complete disappearance, Thomas. They may whisper about me, but they will not erase me entirely." Margaret, Thomas's wife, had reached across the carriage to squeeze Sharon's hand. It was Margaret who insisted on these invitations, who refused to let society forget that Sharon Roberts still existed, still had value beyond her disgrace. But even Margaret's kindness carried the weight of pity, and pity, Sharon had learned, was just another face of condemnation. Now, standing beneath the wisteria arbor as the Duke of Ravenwood asked if she danced, Sharon felt the full weight of those 15 years pressing against her chest. Every ball she had attended as an invisible ghost. Every whispered comment she had pretended not to hear. Every young bride's triumph that served as a mirror to her own failure. Every night she had lain awake wondering what fundamental flaw lived inside her that had made Gerald Whitmore see her as so unworthy that he could not even face her to end their engagement, had simply vanished like morning mist, leaving her to bear the public shame alone. She had become the cautionary tale mothers whispered to their daughters. See what becomes of a woman who reaches too high, who dares to believe herself worthy of happiness. She had become a synonym for failure, for unworthiness, for all the unnamed terrors that haunted every unmarried woman's dreams. And now this man, this perfect, untouchable Duke, stood before her asking if she danced, as if her answer mattered, as if she were simply another guest at the party rather than its resident specter. "I do dance, Your Grace," Sharon heard herself say, though some part of her mind screamed that this must be a trap, a game, some new and creative form of cruelty. "Though I confess it has been some time since anyone has asked." "Then their loss is my unexpected fortune," he replied, extending his hand with the same gravity he might have shown to a duchess. "Would you grant me the honor, Miss Roberts?" Around them, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Sharon could feel Lady Helena's shock like a physical presence, could sense Lady Cordelia's fury radiating across the lawn. Every eye in Pemberton's gardens bore witness to this impossible moment. "You appear," the Duke said quietly as she placed her trembling hand in his, "to be the only person here not performing for an audience." Sharon looked up at him then, truly looked, and saw something unexpected in those piercing blue eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. As if he, too, understood what it meant to be watched, judged, expected to play a role rather than live a life. "That suggests," he continued as he led her toward where other couples had begun to gather for the dance, "either remarkable self-possession or hard-won wisdom. I find myself curious which it might be." For the first time in 15 years, Sharon Roberts felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. "Perhaps, Your Grace," she said softly. "It is both." Chapter 2. Sharon woke the morning after the Pemberton party determined to be sensible. The Duke had danced with her out of courtesy, nothing more, perhaps even pity. A gentleman of his standing would naturally show kindness to someone so obviously outside the social fold. To read anything more into a single dance would be the height of foolishness, the kind of desperate hope that led to devastation. She had just convinced herself of this rational explanation when Martha, the housemaid, appeared in the breakfast room carrying an enormous arrangement of white roses. "These just arrived, miss," Martha said, her eyes wide with poorly concealed excitement. "For you." Sharon's hands trembled as she reached for the small card nestled among the blooms. The handwriting was bold, confident. "For courage well earned. Your servant, Ravenwood." The room seemed to tilt. No gentleman had sent her flowers since before. Since Gerald Whitmore had courted her with spring violets and empty promises, only to leave her standing alone in a church full of wilting orange blossoms. "Sharon." Margaret's voice came from the doorway, soft with wonder. "Are those from—" "The Duke of Ravenwood," Sharon whispered, staring at the roses as if they might vanish if she looked away. Margaret crossed the room quickly, reading the card over Sharon's shoulder. "The Duke of Ravenwood does not send roses casually, Sharon. This means—" "It means nothing," Thomas said sharply, entering behind his wife. His face was set in grim lines. "Or worse, it means he's playing some cruel game. Sharon, you must be careful. If this is some wager, some entertainment for his amusement." "Thomas," Margaret protested, but Sharon heard the fear beneath her brother's anger. He had watched her break 15 years ago. He had held her while she wept until she had no tears left. He could not bear to see it happen again. Neither could she. That was the terrible truth Sharon faced as she touched the soft petals of a white rose. The terror of hoping was nearly unbearable, but the impossibility of not hoping was somehow worse. 3 days later, Sharon stood in the Egyptian Antiquities Gallery of the British Museum, studying a fragment of limestone carved with hieroglyphs. It was her refuge, this quiet space where ancient stones spoke of civilizations that had risen and fallen while human hearts remained stubbornly, painfully the same. "The Book of the Dead," a familiar voice said behind her. "From the 18th dynasty, if I'm not mistaken." Sharon's heart stopped. She turned to find the Duke of Ravenwood standing 3 paces away, his blue eyes fixed on her with that same intense assessment she remembered from the garden. "Your Grace," she managed, executing a curtsy while her mind raced. "This could not be coincidence. Miss Roberts. How fortunate to encounter you here." His tone suggested nothing about their meeting was fortunate chance. "I confess I have long found Egyptian funerary practices fascinating. The belief that one could carry what mattered into the afterlife, it speaks to a kind of hope, doesn't it?" Before Sharon could respond, Lady Cordelia Ashworth's honeyed voice cut through the gallery. "Why, Miss Roberts? How surprising to see you here. I had not realized you had such scholarly interests." The emphasis on scholarly made it clear Lady Ashworth considered Sharon's presence in a museum as presumptuous as her presence at the Pemberton party. But before Sharon could formulate a response that maintained dignity while avoiding direct confrontation, the Duke moved, a subtle shift that placed his tall frame between Sharon and Lady Ashworth, as if by mere accident. "Lady Ashworth," he said coolly, "Miss Roberts and I were just discussing 18th dynasty burial practices. Unless you have particular expertise in ancient Egyptian funerary texts, I fear our conversation would prove tediously academic." Lady Ashworth's smile froze. "Of course, Your Grace. I would not dream of interrupting." She withdrew with barely concealed fury. When she had gone, the Duke turned back to Sharon, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I hope you will forgive my presumption, Miss Roberts. I have taken the liberty of having a volume delivered to your home, a first edition of Tennyson's works. I recalled you mentioning your appreciation for poetry." He had listened. During their single dance, she had mentioned Tennyson once in passing, and he had remembered. "The volume includes a note," he continued quietly, requesting permission to call upon you formally. I hope you will consider granting it." Sharon looked up at this impossible man, and felt the last of her defenses begin to crumble. "I will consider it, Your Grace," she whispered. Chapter 3. The Duke of Ravenwood arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, as his note had promised. Sharon watched from the drawing-room window as his carriage, bearing the Ravenwood crest in gold leaf, drew to a stop before their modest townhouse. Her hands were iced despite the warmth of the afternoon. Thomas stood by the fireplace like a sentinel, his jaw set in lines Sharon recognized as protective fury barely held in check. When the Duke was announced, her brother's greeting held all the warmth of a January frost. "Your Grace, to what do we owe this unexpected honor?" The emphasis on unexpected made clear Thomas's suspicion. "Mr. Roberts." The Duke's tone remained unruffled. "I have come to request permission to speak with your sister." "So I gathered." Thomas did not move from his position. "I confess myself curious as to your intentions. My sister has endured quite enough attention from gentlemen whose purposes proved less than honorable." Sharon felt heat flood her cheeks, but the Duke's expression never wavered. "Your concern for Miss Roberts does you credit, sir. It is precisely that kind of loyalty she deserves." The simple acknowledgment seemed to disarm Thomas slightly. He glanced at Sharon, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, and after a long moment, he withdrew, though his departure to the hallway felt more like a tactical retreat than a true absence. The silence stretched between them until Sharon could bear it no longer. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" The words came out more sharply than she intended. "Truly." Gerald Clem moved to stand before her, and his directness caught her off guard. "Because in a world of practiced performance, you are genuine, Miss Roberts. In 20 years of navigating society's theater, I have never met anyone who simply exists as themselves." "You mistake survival for authenticity," Sharon said, something bitter rising in her throat. "I am 40 years old, Your Grace, with a scandal that has never been forgotten. I have no fortune, no particular beauty, and a past that ensures I will never be welcomed in the circles where you naturally belong. If you seek genuine conversation, surely there are less complicated sources." "Society's memory is selective and its judgments often cruel," he replied, his blue eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "They remember what they choose to remember, and forget what does not serve their narratives. But I am not interested in society's judgment of you." "Then what are you interested in?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I wish to court you, Miss Roberts." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Sharon felt the room tilt, felt 15 years of carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. "You cannot mean that." Her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "You cannot possibly. The scandal, the age difference, what people would say." "I am 45, he interrupted calmly. "Hardly a boy. As for scandal, I find that society's definition of disgrace often reveals more about society than about the person they condemn. And what people say." He paused, something almost like a smile touching his lips. "I have spent 15 years caring far too much about what people say. It has brought me nothing but loneliness." Sharon shook her head, panic rising. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. To be associated with me would." "Miss Roberts." His voice gentled but remained firm. "I see who you are, not who they decided you were 15 years ago. I see a woman who has survived what would have destroyed someone with less strength, who attends social functions not out of desperation but out of quiet defiance, who stands in museums contemplating ancient civilizations because her mind refuses to be limited by others' judgments of her worth." Tears burned behind Sharon's eyes. "Your Grace, I am asking permission to court you," he continued. To call upon you, to know you, to allow you to know me. Not because I pity you or because I am playing some game, but because in a lifetime of perfect performances, you are the first person who has made me want to stop performing entirely. From the hallway came the sound of Margaret's poorly suppressed sob. Sharon realized her sister-in-law had been listening, her hope and fear for Sharon's happiness warring in that single sound. Sharon looked up at Gerald Clem, Duke of Ravenwood, and saw the truth written plainly in his eyes. He meant every word. Impossibly, inexplicably, he meant it. Yes, she whispered, the word escaping before fear could stop it. Yes, you may call upon me. And for the first time in 15 years, Sharon Roberts allowed herself to hope. Chapter 4. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the Duke's younger sister, proved to be a woman of surprising warmth. As their carriage rolled toward Hyde Park, she kept up a steady stream of conversation that required little response, a kindness Sharon recognized as deliberate, designed to ease the tension that thrummed through her like a plucked string. But it was Gerald who finally addressed the silence between them directly. I sense, Miss Roberts, that you doubt not my sincerity but your own worthiness. Sharon's breath caught. Catherine, with admirable discretion, suddenly became deeply interested in the passing scenery. For 15 years, Gerald continued, his voice low enough for her alone, I have been introduced to perfect ladies who performed worthiness like a rehearsed dance. Impeccable lineage, flawless reputations, careful displays of accomplishment. And every single one left me feeling more isolated than before. He turned to face her fully. You have lived through what would have destroyed someone with less strength. That is not unworthiness, Miss Roberts. That is the rarest form of courage. Your Grace, Sharon began, but her words died as a familiar figure stepped into their path as they descended from the carriage. Lady Helena Whitmore, Gerald's sister, stood blocking the walkway with the calculated precision of an executioner choosing her spot. Her smile was all honeyed poison. Miss Roberts. And your Grace. Helena's curtsy was perfect, her tone musical. How extraordinary to see you together. I confess myself quite astonished that anyone would overlook dear Sharon's history. But then, perhaps you have not been properly informed of the particulars. Sharon felt ice flood her veins. 15 years, and Helena still found new ways to twist the knife. But before Sharon could formulate a response that maintained dignity, Gerald's voice cut through the spring air like a blade through silk. Lady Helena. The temperature in his tone could have frozen the serpentine. I find myself perfectly informed of all relevant particulars, including the tendency of certain families to rewrite history in service of their own reputations. Helena's smile faltered. I'm sure I don't know what you. I'm quite certain you do. Gerald stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Helena and Sharon with deliberate intent. Now, if you will excuse us, Lady Helena, we have an engagement to keep. He offered Sharon his arm, and she took it with trembling fingers, allowing him to guide her away. Catherine followed, her expression a mixture of fury and fierce satisfaction. They had walked perhaps 20 paces when Sharon's composure shattered. Her breath came in short gasps, her vision blurring with tears she had forbidden herself to shed in public for 15 years. Sharon. Gerald's use of her given name barely registered. Look at me. Please. She raised her eyes to his, and the concern there, the genuine care, broke something open inside her chest. He left me at the altar, she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush after years of silence, because I refused to give him access to my inheritance before marriage. My parents had died the year before, and Thomas was my guardian. Gerald wanted the money immediately, and when I asked to wait until after the wedding, he simply vanished. Her voice cracked. His family has spent 15 years ensuring everyone believes I was rejected for other reasons. That I was Inadequate somehow. Unsuitable. That there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unworthy of becoming his wife. Gerald's expression transformed into something fierce and protective. That man, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, was a mercenary coward who did not deserve to breathe the same air as you. But everyone believes. I do not care what everyone believes. He took both her hands in his, propriety abandoned. That you survived such calculated cruelty, that you retained your compassion and dignity while they poisoned your reputation. That makes you extraordinary, Sharon. Not damaged. Not unworthy. Extraordinary. Catherine had diplomatically drawn ahead, giving them a moment of privacy on the path. Gerald's thumbs traced gentle circles on Sharon's gloved hands. "Will you take tea with us?" he asked softly. "My sister has a private sitting room at her residence nearby. No crowds. No performances. Just conversation." Sharon nodded, not trusting her voice. And as they walked together toward Catherine's townhouse, she felt something shift inside her. Not just hope this time, but the fragile beginning of belief. Chapter 5. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, the Ravenwood seal pressed into midnight blue wax. Sharon held it with shaking hands as Margaret read over her shoulder. 3 days at Ravenwood Park, Margaret breathed. Sharon, such an invitation will be seen as tantamount to a declaration, Your Grace. Gerald, who had delivered the invitation personally, met Sharon's eyes with unwavering directness. Good. Let them see clearly where my intentions lie. The choice stretched before Sharon like a chasm. Accept and risk everything. Her fragile hope, her painstakingly rebuilt composure, her very heart. Decline, and retreat to the safety of her marginalized existence, forever wondering what might have been. She thought of 15 years of safety. 15 years of surviving but never truly living. "I accept," she whispered. 2 days later, the carriage rounded a bend and Ravenwood Park emerged from the spring landscape like something from a dream. Honey-colored stone glowed in the afternoon sun, mullioned windows reflecting centuries of history. Ancient oaks lined the drive, their branches forming a cathedral arch overhead. Generations of Clems had walked these grounds, had shaped this land, had built this legacy. And Sharon Roberts, jilted spinster, disgraced and 40, was being invited into its heart. "Look." Gerald's voice held an eagerness she had never heard before, almost boyish in its enthusiasm. "There, do you see the East Wing? That's the library. It houses over 10,000 volumes, some dating to the 15th century. His rare display of emotion made her smile despite her nervousness. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he was sharing it with her like a precious gift. Lady Catherine met them at the entrance, embracing Sharon with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Ravenwood. Gerald has spoken of little else but you for weeks. I was beginning to fear he'd bore us all to distraction." "Catherine," Gerald protested, but his sister only laughed. Lord Pemberton, Gerald's childhood friend, bowed over Sharon's hand with courtly grace. The Hartleys, an elderly couple who had known Gerald since birth, greeted her with kindness that held no judgment. These were his inner circle, the people whose opinions mattered to him, and they welcomed her without reservation. Dinner that evening felt like stepping into another world. Sharon found herself seated in the position of honor at Gerald's right, a placement whose significance was not lost on her. But more extraordinary than the placement was the conversation. Genuine, ranging from literature to politics to philosophy. Her opinions were not merely tolerated but actively sought, valued, debated with respect. "What do you make of the Reform Act proposals?" Lord Pemberton asked, and waited with genuine interest for her response. For the first time in 15 years, Sharon felt her mind fully engaged, her thoughts treated as worthy of consideration rather than dismissed as the desperate grasping of a woman trying to seem relevant. After dinner, Catherine led them to the music room. "Sharon plays piano, Gerald tells me," she said with a knowing smile. Sharon's fingers trembled as she sat at the magnificent instrument, but once she began to play, a Chopin nocturne that had always spoken to her soul, the trembling ceased. Music had been her solace in the darkest years, and now it flowed from her fingers like a language more honest than words. When she finished, she looked up to find Gerald watching her with an expression that stole her breath. Wonder, tenderness, something that looked dangerously like love. Later, as the household settled into evening quiet, Gerald found her on the terrace overlooking the gardens. Without a word, his hand found hers in the gathering dusk. "This is what I hoped you would see," he whispered. "Home. Not the house or the title, but this belonging, acceptance, the freedom to be exactly who you are." Sharon's throat tightened with emotion. "Tomorrow," he continued softly, "I wish to show you the rose garden. It was my mother's favorite place. I think you would understand why." That night, lying in the guest chamber with its silk hangings and ancient tapestries, Sharon allowed herself to imagine something she had thought forever lost. Not just happiness but belonging. Not just acceptance but home. For the first time in 15 years, Sharon Roberts dared to imagine a future. Chapter 6. Morning sunlight painted Ravenwood's grounds in shades of gold and green as Gerald led Sharon along winding paths he had known since childhood. He spoke of the estate with the quiet passion of someone describing a beloved friend. The folly his grandfather had built, the lake where he'd learned to fish, the ancient oak his mother had loved. Then they rounded a hedge and Sharon stopped breathing. The rose garden spread before them like something from a painting. Hundreds of blooms in every shade from palest cream to deepest crimson, their fragrance hanging heavy in the warm air. Stone paths wound between carefully tended beds, and at the garden's heart stood a marble bench beneath a climbing rose arbor thick with white blossoms. "My mother designed this," Gerald said softly. "She said roses were proof that beauty could thrive even with thorns, that the most exquisite things often required the most careful tending." Sharon felt tears prick her eyes at the metaphor she suspected was intentional. They walked in silence to the marble bench, and when they sat, the weight of everything unspoken pressed between them. "Why me, Gerald?" The question emerged raw and vulnerable. "Truly." He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes holding hers with devastating honesty. "Because you know the cost of courage. You understand that worth isn't measured by perfection but by what we do with our imperfections, our scars, our survival." His hand found hers. "Every perfect lady I met saw only the title. They saw the Duke of Ravenwood, the estate, the position. You see me. You see the man who has spent 15 years lonely despite constant company, who has performed perfection until he forgot how to be simply human." "But I bring nothing but scandal," Sharon whispered. "Your reputation. What if I cannot give you an heir?" The words burst from her, the fear she had carried since his first rose arrived. "I am 40 years old, Gerald. The chances of—" "What I need," he interrupted gently but firmly, "is a partner, a companion, someone who knows that life is precious precisely because it can be so painful. Someone who will share my days not out of duty but out of choice." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "An heir would be a blessing, yes. But you, Sharon, you would be my life." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Sharon's heart stopped. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, the blue stone the exact color of his eyes. "She wore it every day of her marriage to my father. She told me once that when I found someone who made me want to be brave rather than perfect, I should give it to her." Then Gerald Clem, Duke of Ravenwood, descended to one knee among his mother's roses. "You have shown me what true strength looks like," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the strength of enduring others' expectations, but the courage of remaining yourself despite them. Would you grant me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed down Sharon's face. "Are you certain? Society will. They'll say terrible things, Gerald. They'll call me a fortune hunter, question your judgment, make your life. Let them talk." His voice turned fierce. "I have spent my entire life performing for their approval, and it brought me nothing but isolation. I am choosing you, Sharon. Not despite who you are, but because of it. Will you choose me?" The word rose from somewhere deep inside her, from a place that had forgotten how to hope, how to trust, how to love. "Yes." He slipped the sapphire onto her finger, then rose and cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" Sharon nodded, unable to speak, and when his lips met hers it was tender, reverent, full of promise, a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and hard-won happiness. When they finally drew apart, he took her hand and they walked back toward the house together. No longer hiding, no longer performing, simply two people who had found each other despite everything designed to keep them apart. The sapphire caught the morning light, throwing blue fire across Sharon's finger, a promise that some things were worth the courage it took to claim them. Chapter 7. The announcement in the Times ignited London society like a match to kindling. The Duke of Ravenwood to Miss Sharon Roberts. 11 words that unleashed a firestorm of gossip, speculation, and barely concealed outrage. Lady Cordelia Ashworth led the assault with the precision of a general marshalling troops. Within days, whispers spread through every drawing room in Mayfair. Sharon had trapped him somehow, used feminine wiles to ensnare a vulnerable duke. She was a fortune hunter, a schemer, a desperate woman who had manipulated a moment of misguided charity into an engagement. The 8-week engagement period became a gauntlet Sharon walked daily, each social function a fresh battlefield. At Lady Morrison's soirée, she stood near the refreshment table when Lady Helena Whitmore's voice rang out with calculated clarity. "I simply cannot remain silent when a woman of such questionable virtue is about to deceive one of England's finest men." Helena's face was a mask of concerned righteousness. The Duke clearly does not know the full extent of Miss Roberts's past indiscretions. The room fell silent. Sharon felt ice flood her veins, 15 years of shame threatening to drown her where she stood. But Gerald's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Lady Helena." He crossed the room with deliberate purpose, his expression colder than Sharon had ever seen it. "If you have accusations to make them clearly so they might be answered. Or admit that you traffic in insinuation because the truth would reveal your own family's mercenary cruelty." Helena paled. "Your Grace, You merely attempt to destroy the reputation of a woman whose only crime was refusing to hand her inheritance to your fortune-hunting brother before marriage." His words fell like hammer blows. "A woman who has endured 15 years of whispers because your family chose to protect a coward's reputation at her expense. If you speak against my betrothed again, Lady Helena, you will find the full weight of Ravenwood's influence brought to bear. Am I perfectly clear?" Helena fled in humiliation. But Sharon knew the damage was spreading beyond Helena's poison. Even Gerald's devastating defense couldn't stop the whispers. The crisis came 3 weeks before the wedding. Sharon stood at the modiste's, being fitted for her wedding gown, when she heard the whispers from the adjacent room. "Destroying the Duke's reputation. Generations of honor undone. The duchy itself will suffer." That evening, Gerald arrived at the Roberts' townhouse with his family solicitor, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Mr. Pemberton feels I should be aware," he said quietly, "of the potential damage to the duchy's standing. Several investment opportunities have been quietly withdrawn. Political allies have become distant." For the first time, Sharon saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Not doubt of her, but the weight of generations of responsibility pressing on shoulders that had never before failed their duty. That night, Sharon wrote the letter with shaking hands. "You deserve someone who brings you honor, not scandal. I release you from our engagement." She sent it at dawn. By mid-morning, Gerald burst through her door, the letter crumpled in his fist, his usual composure shattered. "You do not make this decision for me," he said, his voice shaking with fury and something else, fear. "Do you hear me, Sharon? You do not decide what I deserve. I'm trying to protect you." "I don't want protection." The words exploded from him. "I want you. Loving you is not a compromise. It is the first entirely honest thing I have done in 45 years of performing perfection." He crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "I would rather face society's censure with you than their approval without you. I would rather lose every political alliance, every business opportunity, every shallow friend I have ever had, than lose you." "Gerald." "The duchy has endured for 400 years, he continued fiercely. "It will endure this. But I will not endure a life without you. So I am asking you one more time, Sharon Roberts. Will you marry me?" She looked up at him, this impossible man who had chosen her despite everything, and felt her resolve crumble. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Their kiss tasted of tears and defiance and the fierce determination to claim happiness despite the world's disapproval. Chapter 8. Westminster Abbey rose before Sharon like both sanctuary and judgment, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of royal ceremonies and historic moments. Gerald had insisted on the Abbey, refusing to hide their marriage in some quiet country chapel, making instead a public declaration that their love required no apology. Sharon stood in the bride's chamber, her reflection showing a woman transformed. Silk and lace the color of champagne draped her frame, and at her throat blazed the ravenwood sapphires, a parure that had adorned duchesses for 200 years. Her hands trembled as Margaret adjusted her veil. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said quietly, though his eyes shone with emotion. "Even now, if you're uncertain." "I'm terrified," Sharon admitted. "But I'm certain." Thomas took her arm as the organ's opening notes filled the Abbey. "You are the bravest person I know," he whispered. The doors opened and Sharon's breath caught. The Abbey was filled, half with faces that radiated genuine joy, Catherine and Lord Pemberton and the Hartleys beaming from the front pews, but half showed expressions ranging from scandalized disapproval to barely concealed contempt. Lady Cordelia Ashworth sat rigid with fury. Other faces whispered behind fans. Sharon's steps faltered. The last time she had worn white, walked down an aisle, she had been met with empty space and crushing humiliation. Her vision blurred with the memory of standing alone before a church full of pitying eyes. Then she saw Gerald. He stood at the altar in formal dress, his dark coat impeccable, the ravenwood ceremonial sword at his side, every inch the Duke. But his expression held nothing of ducal distance. His eyes blazed with pure love, with certainty, with a devotion so naked it made her breath catch. No doubt. No hesitation. Only love. Sharon's steps steadied. She walked forward, each step an act of courage, each pace a defiance of the past that had tried to destroy her. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice resonant in the vast space, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." "I must object." Lady Helena Whitmore's voice rang out from the congregation. "This woman is not fit to." "Speak now or forever hold your peace," the Archbishop continued firmly, his voice rising over Helena's protest. "I hear nothing." His gaze swept the congregation with unmistakable authority. "Let us continue." Helena sank back into her pew, silenced. The Archbishop turned to Gerald. "Do you, Gerald Arthur Clem, Duke of Ravenwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Gerald's voice rang clear and strong. "With all that I am and all that I have, I pledge myself to you, Sharon." The Archbishop turned to Sharon. Her voice emerged steadier than she had thought possible. "I do. In joy and sorrow, in scandal and triumph, I pledge myself to you, Gerald." "Then by the power vested in me," the Archbishop proclaimed, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Sharon Roberts became Duchess of Ravenwood in that moment, not through birth or fortune, but through love that had refused to bow to society's cruelty. "You may kiss your bride." Gerald's kiss was tender but unrestrained, a seal on their defiance, a promise of everything yet to come. The Abbey erupted in applause from their supporters, while others sat in stony silence. The reception passed in a blur. Catherine's tears of joy, Lord Pemberton's heartfelt toast, the Hartleys' embrace. But also the cold shoulders, the early departures, the whispers that would follow them for years. Finally, they escaped to their carriage bound for Portsmouth and the ship that would carry them to the Italian coast. As the horses pulled away from the Abbey, Sharon turned to Gerald with tears streaming down her face. "I cannot believe this is real. That I am truly your wife." Gerald pulled her close, his own voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you, Sharon, from the moment you looked at me without pretense in that garden, when you saw not a duke but simply a man who was desperately lonely." His kiss was passionate this time, full of promise and desire and fierce joy. "I want everything with you," he whispered against her lips. "Every joy, every challenge, every tomorrow. Every single moment of our lives together." Sharon kissed him back, tasting happiness she had thought forever lost, claiming the future she had earned through courage. Chapter 9. The Italian coast stretched before them like a painting come to life. Azure waters meeting cloudless sky, ancient villages clinging to cliffsides, the air perfumed with lemon blossoms and salt. The villa Gerald had secured overlooked the Mediterranean, its terraces cascading down toward the sea in a riot of bougainvillea and jasmine. For 3 weeks, they existed in a world apart from English judgment, from whispers and scandal. They explored crumbling Roman ruins and dined at sunset on terraces where the only witnesses were gulls and distant fishing boats. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Childhood dreams, favorite books, the weight of expectations they had both carried for far too long. One evening, as the sun painted the water gold and crimson, Sharon stood at the terrace edge and finally spoke the words that had lived in her heart like stones for 15 years. "I spent all that time believing I was unworthy of love," she whispered. "That Gerald's abandonment proved something fundamentally broken inside me. That no one would ever choose me because I wasn't enough." Gerald came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You were always worthy," he said softly. "The world was simply blind. I am only grateful that when my own eyes finally opened, you were still there to be seen." That night, their intimacy went beyond the physical joining of bodies. It was the healing of old wounds, the claiming of joy that had been denied too long, the discovery that love could indeed bloom in hearts that had learned to protect themselves with walls of ice. 1 year later, Sharon stood in Ravenwood's ballroom preparing for their autumn ball, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. At 41, she moved through her role as Duchess with confidence earned through surviving what should have destroyed her. The whispers had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened. "Society has remarkably short memory," Catherine observed with satisfaction, "when confronted with happiness so obvious it cannot be denied." That evening, before their guests, Gerald made an announcement that silenced even the remaining skeptics. The Duchess was expecting a child. 6 months later, on a spring morning that seemed designed by Providence itself, Elizabeth and Clem entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through Ravenwood's ancient halls. Sharon, exhausted and overwhelmed, held her miracle daughter while Gerald sat beside them on the bed, his face wet with tears. "She is proof," Sharon whispered, touching Elizabeth's perfect tiny hand, "that it is never too late for new beginnings." Years passed in a succession of golden moments. The nursery where Elizabeth took her first steps. The library where she learned to read, sprawled on the carpet between her parents. The rose garden where she played among the blooms her grandmother had planted decades before. One afternoon, Sharon sat reading while Elizabeth, now 5, played with her dolls in a pool of sunlight. Gerald looked up from his correspondence and caught Sharon's eye, and something in his expression made her heart catch. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking," he said, crossing to kneel beside her chair, "how I spent so long believing my story was already written, that I knew how every chapter would unfold." Sharon touched his face tenderly. "And now I know it had not even truly begun." His smile held everything: love, gratitude, wonder at the gift of each ordinary day. "Not until you." Their kiss was still passionate after all these years, still tinged with the gratitude of people who had found each other despite everything designed to keep them apart. Elizabeth looked up from her dolls. "Papa, you're being mushy again." They laughed, and Gerald pulled his daughter into their embrace, the three of them tangled together in afternoon sunlight streaming through ancient windows. Later that week, a painter arrived to complete the family portrait commissioned for Ravenwood's gallery. Sharon stood between Gerald and Elizabeth, sapphires at her throat, her hand resting on her husband's arm. The painter captured something in her expression, not just happiness, but the hard-won knowledge that shame need not be permanent, that the past need not imprison the future, that love could indeed bloom in the most unlikely soil. Sharon Roberts, once society's cautionary tale, had become its reluctant inspiration. And in the library at Ravenwood, surrounded by the family she had thought forever lost to her, she finally understood that her story had always been leading here. To this moment, this love, this impossible joy. To home.